Have you ever poured your heart and soul into something, only to have someone else take credit for it? What if I told you that sometimes the smallest oversight can become your greatest advantage? Today, I'm sharing a story about what happened when my manager gave away my project without realizing I still held the keys to the kingdom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the exact moment everything changed at Vertex Digital Solutions. It was a Tuesday morning in Seattle, raining as usual, and I was running late because I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. fixing an urgent bug in our analytics platform. As I hurried through the office with my coffee threatening to spill, I noticed a cluster of people gathered around a desk in the engineering department. My desk. There stood David Miller, our newly appointed director of engineering, showing someone around my workstation. Not just anyone, a fresh-faced intern who looked barely old enough to have finished college. And this is where you'll be working, Jason. Sarah's codebase is a bit outdated, but it'll be a good starting point for you to rebuild from scratch. I froze mid-step, coffee forgotten in my hand. My codebase? Outdated? I'd spent the last 2 years building Vertex Track from nothing. It was our company's most successful analytics product, handling millions of data points daily for our biggest clients. And David was casually handing it over to an intern like it was a practice exercise. "Sarah! Perfect timing," David called out, finally noticing me hovering at the edge of the circle. "Meet Jason Bennett, our new junior developer. He's got some fresh ideas for modernizing Vertex Track. I've assigned him to take over the project moving forward." The intern, Jason, extended his hand with an eager smile. "So excited to work on this. I have some great ideas to refactor the backend. I think we could switch to React and maybe rebuild the entire data pipeline." I shook his hand mechanically, mind racing. He seemed nice enough. This wasn't his fault. But rebuild my entire data pipeline? The one that had taken me 8 months to perfect? The one that handled terabytes of sensitive client data without a single breach or performance issue? "David, could we talk privately for a moment?" I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. David's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Sure. I have about 5 minutes before my next meeting." In his glass-walled office, I waited for the door to close before speaking. "Vertex Track is stable, scalable, and our clients love it. What's this about rebuilding it from scratch?" David leaned back in his ergonomic chair, the Seattle skyline behind him providing a dramatic backdrop. He'd been with the company for only 3 months, brought in after our previous director left for a startup. Unlike his predecessor, who had spent years in the trenches coding before moving to management, David came from a strictly business background. "Sarah, technology moves fast. Your approach was great for when you built it, but we need to stay cutting edge. Jason has experience with the latest frameworks from his coursework." "Coursework?" I echoed. "David, I've spent 2 years building, testing, and refining this system. It processes financial data for 37 major clients. You can't just hand it over to someone with 0 professional experience because his classroom knowledge seems cutting edge." David's expression hardened. "I appreciate your passion, but this is business. We need to evolve constantly. Besides, I think you've gotten too comfortable with this project. It's time for some fresh perspectives." My hands gripped the arms of my chair. "And what am I supposed to work on instead?" "I'm glad you asked." He slid a folder across his desk. "I'm putting you on documentation for our legacy systems. Your attention to detail will be perfect for it." Documentation. After 2 years of leading development on our flagship product, I was being demoted to writing user manuals for outdated systems nobody cared about. "This feels like a step backward in my career path," I said, choosing my words carefully. David's smile was all corporate polish. Think of it as a lateral move, Sarah, a chance to broaden your skills. I left his office in a daze, the folder untouched on his desk. Back at my station, Jason was already scrolling through my codebase, making small sounds of disapproval. My colleagues avoided eye contact. Had everyone known this was coming except me? Over the next week, I watched as Jason began dismantling my work piece by piece. He'd ask me occasional questions that revealed he didn't understand the fundamental architecture of the system, why certain security protocols were in place, why the database was structured a specific way, why I'd chosen particular API endpoints. Each time I'd patiently explain the rationale, the countless hours of trial and error, the client-specific customizations. He'd nod enthusiastically, thank me, then proceed to ignore everything I'd said. The worst part wasn't Jason. He was just eager and inexperienced. The worst part was David, who began to reference Jason's analytics platform in company-wide emails. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As if my name could be so easily erased from something I'd built from the ground up. 2 weeks into this nightmare, I discovered they'd revoked my admin access to the main repository. I'd gone to push a critical security patch I'd worked on over the weekend, only to find my credentials rejected. I messaged David immediately. Was my repository access revoked? His reply came an hour later. Yes, standard procedure when transitioning off a project. Don't worry about security updates. Jason's handling those now. I stared at my screen, a cold feeling spreading through my chest. They were pushing me out of my own creation. But David had made one critical oversight. While they'd removed my access to the main GitHub repository, they'd forgotten about the AWS backend. I still had full administrative access to our cloud infrastructure, database configurations, and deployment pipelines. I hadn't set it up this way to be underhanded. When I'd built Vertex Track, I'd established separate access protocols as a security measure. Code repository access and cloud infrastructure access were intentionally decoupled to prevent any single breach from compromising the entire system. It was a best practice I'd implemented after reading about a major hack at a competitor. But now, this security feature had become my window into what was happening to my project. And what I saw alarmed me. Jason was making sweeping changes without understanding the dependencies. He'd deleted crucial validation functions, modified database schemas without migration paths, removed security checks that were essential for our finance clients, all in the name of modernization. I documented every change, every regression, every potential vulnerability, not out of spite, but out of genuine concern for the product I'd built and the clients who relied on it. If Vertex Track failed, real businesses would lose access to critical data. Then came the Wednesday morning when everything boiled over. I arrived at work to find the office in chaos. Clients were calling nonstop. Our biggest customer, a Fortune 500 financial services company, couldn't access any of their dashboards. Data wasn't flowing, reports weren't generating. I made my way to the engineering section where Jason sat surrounded by senior developers, all staring at screens full of error messages. "What happened?" I asked quietly. One of my colleagues, Marcus, glanced up. "The new deployment crashed. In production. Nobody can figure out why. The logs are a mess." I could have said, "I told you so." I could have walked away. But that wasn't who I was. "Can I help?" Marcus looked relieved, but before he could respond, David appeared behind. "This isn't your project anymore," he said firmly. "The team will handle it." I turned to face him. "With all due respect, David, the system is down. Clients are losing money by the minute. I know this codebase better than anyone." "We need to let Jason work through this," he insisted. "It's a valuable learning experience." Learning experience? At the expense of our biggest clients? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I lowered my voice. "David, I can fix this in minutes. Please let me help." His expression was immovable. "Return to your documentation tasks, Sarah. That's an order." I walked back to my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at the blank documentation template I was supposed to be filling out. Clients were losing thousands of dollars every minute while David protected his ego. That's when I made my decision. I wouldn't sabotage anything. That wasn't ethical or professional. But I also wouldn't stand by while the project I'd built burned to the ground. I still had access to the AWS console. I could see exactly what was happening. The issue was obvious to me immediately. Jason had deployed changes that broke the authentication service, which in turn had crashed the entire data pipeline. But in trying to fix it, he was looking in all the wrong places, making changes that would only compound the problem. I opened my personal email and drafted a message to our CTO, Melissa Johnson. Melissa had been on extended leave for a family emergency and hadn't been part of any of these decisions. She'd always supported my work and understood its value. The email was factual and unemotional. I explained the current outage, identified the exact issue causing it, and provided step-by-step instructions to fix it. I included screenshots from the AWS console showing the broken configuration. Finally, I briefly outlined the events of the past weeks, how my project had been reassigned, how my warnings about Jason's inexperience had been dismissed, and how I still maintained access to the cloud infrastructure due to the security architecture I'd designed. I hit send, then waited. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. "Sarah? It's Melissa. Are you at your desk right now?" "Yes," I replied. "Stay there. I'm calling an emergency meeting in 5 minutes." What happened next would change everything at Vertex Digital Solutions, though not in the way David might have expected. As I gathered my laptop and notes, I felt strangely calm. This wasn't about revenge or hurt feelings anymore. This was about responsibility. To the product I'd built, to the clients who trusted us, and to my own professional integrity. I'd spent years building not just a product, but a reputation for excellence. And I wasn't about to let someone erase that because they didn't understand what they were dismantling. The meeting room was tense when I arrived. Melissa sat at the head of the table, her expression grave. Our CEO, Thomas Wright, was on video conference from the New York office, looking deeply concerned. David stood near the whiteboard, arms crossed, defensively, while Jason sat hunched in his chair, eyes fixed on his laptop. "Sarah," Melissa gestured to an open seat. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Can you walk us through exactly what's happening?" I opened my laptop and connected to the projector. Without drama or accusation, I showed them the AWS console, pointing out the specific configuration errors in the latest deployment. The authentication service is misconfigured, which has created a cascade of failures throughout the system, I explained. Additionally, there have been fundamental changes to the data pipeline architecture over the past 2 weeks that have removed critical security and validation features. I displayed a side-by-side comparison of the original architecture and the current one, highlighting the missing components and broken connections. "Can you fix it?" Thomas asked from the screen, cutting straight to the point. "Yes," I said. "I can restore the core services within minutes by rolling back to the last stable configuration. A complete recovery will take longer, but I can minimize client impact immediately." Thomas nodded. "Do it." David stepped forward. "With all due respect, this is Jason's project now. He should—" "David!" Thomas interrupted sharply. "Our largest clients have been down for over an hour. This isn't the time for ownership disputes. Sarah, please proceed." With all eyes on me, I accessed the deployment console and executed a targeted rollback of the authentication services. Within minutes, the error logs began to clear, and the monitoring dashboard showed green status indicators returning. "Services are coming back online," I confirmed. Data flow should resume momentarily. The relief in the room was palpable. As systems returned to normal functioning, Melissa turned to me. "Sarah, can you explain why you still had access to these systems after being removed from the project?" I kept my explanation technical and neutral. When I designed Vertex Track, I implemented a security architecture that intentionally separates code repository access from infrastructure access. It's an industry best practice to prevent single-point compromise. When I was removed from the GitHub repository, the separate AWS access wasn't addressed. Melissa nodded thoughtfully. "So this security measure you implemented, which was apparently overlooked during the transition, is actually what allowed you to identify and fix the problem today?" "Yes," I confirmed. "It's documented in the system architecture guide I created last year." David shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't aware of this separate access system." "It's on page 3 of the transition documentation I prepared when you first discussed moving me off the project," I said quietly. I highlighted it as a critical consideration. Melissa and Thomas exchanged glances through the video feed. "Sarah," Thomas said, "I'd like you to lead the complete recovery effort and ensure all security measures are properly restored. Can you prepare a comprehensive assessment of what changes need to be reversed or modified to maintain system integrity?" "Of course," I agreed. "I can have that to you by end of day." "And David," Thomas continued, "I'd like to speak with you privately after this meeting." As the emergency session concluded, people filed out silently. Jason lingered, looking lost and embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said when we were alone. "I thought I understood the system better than I did. I was trying to impress everyone." His honesty was disarming. "It's a complex system," I told him. "It took me 2 years to build it to this point. Nobody expects you to master it in 2 weeks." "Will you teach me?" he asked hesitantly. "The right way? I want to learn, not just show off." His request surprised me. "Yes," I decided. "But we do it methodically. No shortcuts." As I walked back to my desk, messages were already flooding in from relieved clients as their dashboards came back online. My mind wasn't on their gratitude, though. It was on the meeting I knew was happening in Thomas's office. I wasn't interested in seeing David punished. That wasn't why I'd sent that email. I just wanted recognition for the work I'd done, the expertise I'd developed, and the value I brought to the company. I wanted to be judged by the quality of my work, not by someone's preconceptions about what cutting edge looked like. Later that afternoon, Melissa stopped by my desk. "The recovery plan looks good," she said, reviewing the document I'd prepared. "Thomas wants you to implement it immediately with whatever resources you need." She paused. "He also wanted me to tell you that your role is being reevaluated, in a good way." "And David?" I couldn't help asking. Melissa's expression was measured. "Let's just say there's been a recalibration of perspectives. David will be focusing on different aspects of the business moving forward." I nodded, understanding the corporate speak. David wasn't being fired, but his authority over technical decisions was being curtailed. "One more thing," Melissa added. "The CTO office is launching a new initiative on technical ownership and credit attribution. I'd like you to help develop the framework. We need to make sure that the people who build our systems are properly recognized and consulted in decisions about those systems." For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lifting. Not because I'd won some office battle, but because something meaningful might come from this ordeal. A structural change that could protect other developers from similar situations. As I began implementing the recovery plan, I reflected on what had happened. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very security measure I'd implemented to protect the system had ended up protecting me as well. Not because I'd planned it that way, but because I'd done things the right way from the beginning. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't about fighting back. It's about knowing your worth and refusing to let others define it for you. It's about building things properly, documenting them thoroughly, and having the courage to speak up when something isn't right, even when everyone expects you to stay quiet. The code repository incident would become something of a legend at Vertex Digital Solutions. Not because I had fought a dramatic battle, but because it fundamentally changed how the company valued and protected the contributions of its technical staff. As for me, I learned that my greatest leverage wasn't access to a system that others had forgotten about. It was the depth of knowledge I'd built, the care I'd put into my work, and my willingness to stand up for it, even when it would have been easier to walk away. The next morning, I arrived at the office before anyone else. The early Seattle light cast long shadows through the empty workspace as I settled at my desk with a steaming cup of coffee. I needed quiet time to think, to plan my next steps carefully. The crisis had been averted yesterday, but I knew this was just the beginning of a longer journey. My phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Meeting with Thomas at 10. Your presence requested." I took a deep breath. These next few hours would be crucial, not just for my career, but for establishing a precedent about how technical contributions were valued at Vertex. I opened my laptop and began preparing. First, I created a comprehensive document detailing Vertex Track's complete architecture, not the simplified version I'd shown in yesterday's emergency meeting, but the full, intricate ecosystem with all its interconnections, security measures, and client-specific customizations. I included performance metrics, client satisfaction ratings, and revenue figures. This wasn't just a technical document. It was a business case for why the system worked as designed. Next, I pulled together a timeline of the past 3 weeks. When I was removed from the project, what changes were implemented after my removal, when I first noticed critical issues, and my attempts to raise concerns. I kept the language neutral and fact-based, focusing on system integrity rather than personal feelings. Finally, I drafted a proposal. Not for getting my project back, that wasn't the point, but for implementing a technical ownership framework that would prevent similar situations in the future. It included clear transition protocols, mandatory code reviews for major architectural changes, and a recognition system for individual contributors. By the time others began filtering into the office, I had 3 concise professional documents ready. I noticed David arrive, his usual confident stride replaced by something more measured. He didn't stop by the engineering section as he typically would. Instead, he went straight to his office and closed the door. Jason arrived looking like he hadn't slept. When he saw me, he approached hesitantly. "Is everything fixed?" he asked. "The critical systems are restored," I told him. "There's still work to do on some of the data visualization components, but client dashboards are functional." Relief washed over his face. "They're saying you saved the company millions in potential contract penalties." I hadn't known that detail. It made sense. Our service-level agreements with financial clients included steep penalties for extended outages, but no one had mentioned specific figures. "I just did what needed to be done," I said. "How are you holding up?" He looked down. "Honestly, terrible. Everyone thinks I'm the guy who crashed the system." "You made changes without understanding the full architecture," I said. "That's not entirely your fault. You were put in charge of a complex system without adequate transition or training." "David said the codebase was straightforward," Jason admitted. "He said I could modernize it in a few weeks." I suppressed a sigh. That explained a lot about the reckless pace of changes. "Listen," I told him, "this could be a valuable learning experience if you approach it right. Technical skill is important, but so is humility. The willingness to learn a system before trying to rebuild it." Jason nodded slowly. "If I'm still here after this mess, would you consider mentoring me? For real this time?" "Let's get through today first," I said. "But yes, I'd be open to that." As I walked to Thomas's office for our 10 a.m. meeting, I felt surprisingly calm. Yesterday had been about crisis management. Today was about setting things right on a more fundamental level. Thomas's corner office had a panoramic view of Puget Sound. Today the water was a steely gray under cloudy skies. Melissa was already there, reviewing documents on her tablet. David sat stiffly in one of the visitor chairs. "Sarah, thank you for joining us," Thomas said, gesturing to an open seat. "I've asked the three of you here to discuss not just yesterday's incident, but the underlying issues that led to it. I placed my prepared documents on the table, but didn't distribute them yet. Better to hear what they had to say first." "I've spoken with our major clients," Thomas continued. "They were understandably concerned about the outage, but relieved by the quick resolution. What they're more concerned about is ensuring it doesn't happen again." He turned to David. "Would you like to share your perspective on how we got here?" David straightened his tie. "I made an error in judgment," he said, his voice measured. "I believed that modernizing Vertex Track required a fresh approach, and I underestimated the complexity of the existing system. I should have implemented a more structured transition plan." It was a careful statement, acknowledging mistake without accepting full responsibility. He didn't mention removing me from the project or ignoring my warnings. "And what about the decision to remove Sarah from the project she built?" Thomas asked directly. David hesitated. "I wanted to bring fresh perspectives to our flagship product. Sarah is obviously skilled, but I felt the system needed a more current approach." "More current than what?" Melissa interjected. "The architecture Sarah designed handles millions of data points daily with 98% uptime. It's scalable, secure, and our clients love it. What exactly were you trying to fix?" David shifted uncomfortably. "The front-end components could be more interactive. The codebase uses some older frameworks. Jason had ideas from academic projects," Melissa finished for him. "Not proven solutions for enterprise-level financial data processing." Thomas held up a hand. "The question isn't whether we can improve Vertex Track. All software evolves. The question is why this decision was made without proper technical evaluation, without a transition plan, and without consulting the system's principal architect." The room fell silent. This was my opening. "If I may," I said, sliding my documents across the table. "I've prepared some materials that might be helpful." As they reviewed my architecture overview, timeline, and proposal, I explained each document briefly. I didn't need to embellish or accuse. The facts spoke for themselves. Thomas studied the revenue figures I'd included. "Vertex Track generated 43% of our total revenue last quarter?" "Yes," I confirmed. "It's become our core product, especially for financial sector clients." He turned to my proposal for a technical ownership framework. "This is thorough. You developed this overnight?" "The situation has been developing for weeks," I explained. "I've had time to think about structural solutions." Melissa nodded approvingly. "This addresses many of the issues I've been concerned about regarding attribution and transition protocols." David flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. "I didn't review the full architecture documentation before making changes to the project assignments," he admitted. "That was a serious oversight on my part." It was the closest thing to a real apology I was likely to get. I acknowledged it, with a small nod. Thomas leaned back in his chair. "Here's what's going to happen. Sarah, you're being reinstated as technical lead for Vertex Track effective immediately. You'll have full authority over the system architecture and any significant changes." My heart skipped. This was more than I'd expected. "Additionally," he continued, "I'm approving your technical ownership framework proposal in principle. Melissa will work with you to refine and implement it company-wide. David will remain Director of Engineering, but technical decisions for established systems will require sign-off from the principal architects of those systems." He turned to David. This isn't a demotion. It's a clarification of how technical decisions should be made. Business strategy is important, but it can't override technical integrity without proper evaluation. David's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Acceptance. One last thing, Thomas said. Sarah, I'd like you to mentor Jason properly. From what I've heard, he has potential, but was placed in an impossible situation. I can do that, I agreed. As we left Thomas's office, the weight of the past weeks began to lift. This wasn't just about getting my project back. It was about establishing respect for technical expertise throughout the company. Melissa caught up with me in the hallway. That was impressive, she said quietly. You could have gone in guns blazing, but you chose a systemic solution instead of a personal victory. It was never about me versus David, I told her honestly. It was about building things the right way and having that work respected. We need more of that thinking, she said, which is why I want you to head the committee implementing your framework, with a promotion to senior technical architect. I stopped walking. That's a new position? One we should have created long ago, Melissa said. Thomas agreed immediately when I proposed it this morning. The promotion meant more than a title change or salary increase. It was formal recognition. That technical architecture deserved a dedicated leadership track, separate from engineering management. It was structural change. Back at my desk, I found a message from Jason asking when we could start a proper code review of Vertex Track. Not to undo all his changes, some of his ideas for the front end were actually innovative, but to help him understand the architecture before making further modifications. I scheduled a meeting for the following morning. It was time to start. Building bridges rather than walls. That evening, as I walked to my car beneath a sky turning to twilight, I reflected on how quickly things had shifted. 3 weeks ago, I'd been unceremoniously removed from my project. Yesterday, the system had crashed spectacularly. Today, I had not only regained my position but advanced to a new role with broader influence. The irony wasn't lost on me. David's attempt to sideline me had ultimately elevated my voice within the company. At home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window overlooking the city lights. My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Layla, who worked at another tech company across town. Heard through the grapevine there was drama at Vertex. You okay? News traveled fast in Seattle's tech community. I considered how to respond, knowing that how I characterized today's events would shape the narrative beyond Vertex's walls. All good, I typed. Some growing pains as we establish better protocols for technical ownership actually led to positive changes. It wasn't the gossipy response she was probably hoping for, but it was the truth, and it reflected how I wanted to approach this new chapter, looking forward, not backward. The next morning, I arrived early again, but with a different purpose. I spent the first hour reviewing all the changes Jason had made to Vertex Track over the past weeks. Some were problematic, but others showed genuine insight. His ideas for making the dashboard more interactive had merit, even if his implementation had been flawed. When he arrived for our meeting, I had prepared a detailed overview of why the system was architected the way it was. The technical decisions, the business considerations, the security requirements. Not to shut down his ideas, but to provide context for them. The problem wasn't that you wanted to modernize the front end, I explained. It's that you didn't understand how it connected to the back-end services. Let me show you the complete data flow. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through the system architecture, answering his questions and acknowledging when he spotted potential improvements. This wasn't about protecting my creation from change. It was about ensuring changes were made with full understanding of the consequences. This makes so much more sense now, Jason said as we wrapped up. David just said to rebuild it more modern. He never explained why it was built this way in the first place. That's the problem with treating code like a black box, I told him. You need to understand the why, not just the what. As the day progressed, I noticed subtle shifts in the office dynamic. Colleagues who had avoided eye contact during my removal from the project now stopped by to ask questions or offer congratulations on my promotion. David remained in his office, emerging only for scheduled meetings. By Friday, a company-wide email announced the new technical ownership framework and my appointment to lead its implementation. The response was overwhelmingly positive, especially from the engineering team. Many had apparently harbored similar concerns about attribution and transition protocols, but hadn't known how to address them. The following Monday, I presented the framework to the entire technical staff. Standing at the front of the conference room, I felt a new kind of confidence, not just in my technical abilities, but in my capacity to drive structural change. This isn't about protecting individual egos, I explained. It's about respecting the knowledge and intention behind our systems. When we understand why something was built a certain way, we make better decisions about how to evolve it. I outlined the new protocols, proper documentation requirements, mandatory transition periods when reassigning projects, recognition for principal architects in product materials, and clear processes for evaluating major architectural changes. The goal isn't to prevent innovation, I emphasized. It's to ensure innovation builds on our collective knowledge rather than discarding it. After the presentation, several engineers approached me with their own stories of having work reassigned without proper transition or seeing their contributions minimized in project narratives. It was clear the framework addressed a widespread concern. One senior developer, Wei, pulled me aside. "I've been thinking about leaving Vertex," he admitted quietly. "After seeing what happened with Vertex Track, I worried my work could be discarded just as easily. This framework makes me reconsider." His words struck me. The impact of how we recognize technical contributions extended beyond individual projects to retention of talent, something every tech company struggled with. Over the next few weeks, Jason and I worked together to implement thoughtful improvements to Vertex Track. His ideas for the front end were genuinely innovative, and with proper understanding of the back-end architecture, he was able to implement them without compromising system integrity. "You're a good mentor," he told me after we successfully deployed the first phase of updates. "I've learned more in 3 weeks with you than in my entire last year of school." "That's because real systems are more complex than classroom examples," I said. "They have histories and contexts and real-world constraints that academic projects don't." As for David, he maintained a professional distance. Our interactions were cordial but limited to necessary communications. I didn't seek conflict, but I also didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We had found a workable equilibrium, and that was enough for now. The real transformation occurred in how technical decisions were made throughout the company. With the new framework in place, engineers had clear channels for documenting their contributions and raising concerns about proposed changes. Project transitions included mandatory knowledge transfer periods. Principal architects were consulted on major decisions affecting their systems. These weren't revolutionary concepts in the abstract, but implementing them systematically represented a significant cultural shift for Vertex. It meant acknowledging that technical expertise wasn't interchangeable, that the knowledge of how and why systems were built held real business value. 6 weeks after the system crash, Thomas called me to his office again. This time, the meeting was just the two of us. "The technical ownership framework has been more impactful than I anticipated," he said, gesturing for me to take a seat. "We've seen increased engagement from the engineering team, and several potential hires have specifically mentioned it as a reason they're interested in Vertex. It addresses a common pain point in tech," I explained. "Engineers pour themselves into building systems, only to see their contributions minimized or their expertise overlooked when business decisions are made." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I've been in technology for 20 years. and I've never seen a company approach this issue so systematically. I think we have an opportunity to position Vertex as a leader in technical culture. What do you mean? I'd like you to present our framework at the Northwest Tech Leadership Conference next month, he said. It aligns perfectly with their theme of building sustainable technical organizations. This could become part of Vertex's identity in the industry. The suggestion caught me off guard. I had focused on solving an internal problem, not on creating a public-facing initiative. But Thomas was right. The framework addressed an industry-wide issue that few companies had tackled effectively. I'd be honored, I told him, but I'd like to include specific metrics on how the framework has impacted our operations, not just cultural benefits, but business outcomes. Absolutely, Thomas agreed. Work with our analytics team to gather whatever data you need. This is a priority. As I left his office, I reflected on the strange trajectory of the past 2 months. What had begun as a personal setback, being removed from a project I had built, had catalyzed a company-wide transformation in how technical contributions were valued, and now it was poised to become part of Vertex's public identity. The following week, I met with our analytics team to define metrics for measuring the framework's impact. We tracked everything from system stability improvements to developer retention rates to the time required for knowledge transfer during project transitions. The data told a compelling story. Respecting technical ownership wasn't just good for engineer morale, it made sound business sense. Meanwhile, Vertex Track continued to evolve under my technical leadership. With Jason's front-end improvements fully implemented, client satisfaction scores reached new highs. We were now exploring machine learning components to enhance the analytics capabilities, a project Jason was increasingly taking ownership of under my guidance. David and I had established a functional working relationship. He focused on business strategy and client relationships, areas where he genuinely excelled, while I oversaw technical architecture decisions. It wasn't friendship, but it was productive coexistence. One afternoon, as I was reviewing documentation for the upcoming conference presentation, David stopped by my desk, something he rarely did. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. I nodded, curious about what prompted this unusual visit. "I've been reflecting on what happened with Vertex Track," he said, taking a seat beside my desk. "I made assumptions about your work without taking the time to understand it. That was a serious professional misjudgment on my part." It was the most direct acknowledgement he'd offered about the incident. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "The framework you've implemented," he continued, "it's changed how I approach technical decisions. I'm learning to ask different questions before proposing changes." His admission surprised me. I had assumed he viewed the framework primarily as a limitation on his authority. "That's exactly what it's designed to do," I told him. "Not to prevent change, but to ensure changes are made with full context." He nodded. "I've been asked to participate in a panel discussion at the Northwest Conference on bridging the gap between business strategy and technical implementation. I was hoping you might review my talking points, given your perspective." The request represented a significant shift. David was acknowledging my expertise, not just in coding, but in the broader question of how technical and business considerations intersect. "I'd be happy to," I said. As he walked away, I realized something important had changed. This wasn't about who had won or lost our earlier conflict. It was about establishing a new kind of collaboration, one where different forms of expertise were recognized and respected. The following day, I received an unexpected email from a former colleague who had left Vertex a year earlier for a major tech firm in San Francisco. The subject line read, "Your technical ownership framework is making waves. Word is spreading about what you've implemented at Vertex," she wrote. "Several senior engineers here have been discussing it as a potential model for our own organization. Would you be open to a call to discuss the details? Our VP of Engineering is interested. Similar messages followed from contacts at other companies. The framework, which hadn't even been publicly presented yet, was generating interest throughout the industry. Engineers were sharing it through professional networks, recognizing its potential to address a pervasive problem. As I prepared my conference presentation, I realized that what had happened with Vertex Track wasn't just a personal vindication or a company-specific solution. It was touching on a fundamental tension in how technical work is valued and managed, a tension that affected engineers across the industry. The narrative was shifting from a story about access to a code repository to a larger conversation about respecting the knowledge embedded in technical systems. It wasn't about ownership in the possessive sense, but about recognition and informed stewardship. 2 months after being unceremoniously removed from my project, I stood at the podium of the Northwest Tech Leadership Conference. Looking out at the room full of engineering leaders, product managers, and executives, I felt the weight of representing not just Vertex, but a perspective that many engineers hoped would transform their own workplaces. The most valuable asset in any technical organization isn't the code itself, I began. It's the knowledge of why that code exists in the form it does, the history of decisions, trade-offs, and lessons learned that shaped it. When we discard that knowledge, we don't just risk technical failures, we undermine the very foundation of sustainable innovation. As I outlined the technical ownership framework and its impact at Vertex, I saw nodding heads and furious note-taking throughout the audience. This wasn't just resonating. It was addressing a pain point that many had experienced, but few had systematically addressed. After the presentation, the questions came rapidly. How had we measured impact? How did we handle disagreements about technical direction? How did the framework affect new development versus maintenance of existing systems? I answered each question honestly, acknowledging the framework's limitations and evolving nature. This wasn't a perfect solution, but a thoughtful starting point for addressing a complex problem. As the session ended, a line formed of people wanting to continue the conversation. Technical directors seeking advice on implementing similar protocols. Engineers looking for strategies to advocate for such changes in their organizations. Even investors interested in how such frameworks might affect company valuations by reducing technical debt and knowledge loss. Standing there, responding to this unexpected wave of interest, I realized how far beyond my original situation this had grown. What had begun as a personal response to having my project reassigned had evolved into a movement for changing how technical contributions are valued throughout the industry. The irony wasn't lost on me. If David hadn't removed me from Vertex Track, if he hadn't overlooked my continued access to the AWS infrastructure, if the system hadn't crashed at precisely the moment it did, none of this larger conversation might have happened. Sometimes, I reflected, the most significant changes come from moments of crisis, not because crisis is necessary, but because it creates openings for addressing underlying problems that have long been ignored. As I gathered my presentation materials, Thomas approached with a broad smile. "You've started something important here," he said, "and it's just the beginning." The applause from the Northwest Tech Leadership Conference had barely faded when the first real test of our technical ownership framework arrived. 3 days after my return to Seattle, I received an urgent message from Thomas requesting my presence in the executive conference room. No explanation, just immediate attendance required. When I arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his normally composed expression tight with concern. Melissa was beside him, reviewing documents with intense focus. Across from them sat 3 unfamiliar faces in expensive suits, clearly not Vertex employees. "Sarah, thank you for coming quickly," Thomas said, gesturing to an empty chair. "These gentlemen are from Quantum Dynamics." My stomach tightened. Quantum Dynamics was one of the largest tech conglomerates on the West Coast, known for aggressive acquisition of promising startups and mid-sized companies. Their presence here could only mean one thing. They've expressed interest in acquiring Vertex, Thomas confirmed, specifically because of Vertex Track's success in the financial analytics sector. The man in the center, gray-haired with calculating eyes, extended his hand. Martin Reynolds, head of strategic acquisitions at Quantum. Your presentation at the conference was impressive. Very innovative approach to technical documentation and transition protocols. I shook his hand, noting the carefully neutral expression that didn't quite match his complimentary words. Thank you. It's been transformative for our development processes. I'm sure, he replied. Though our experience suggests that such frameworks, while admirable, often need to be integrated into the acquiring company's existing protocols after acquisition. And there it was, the first indication that in Quantum's vision, our framework would be dismantled and replaced with whatever system they already had in place. Everything we'd built would be absorbed and homogenized. Thomas cleared his throat. We've been discussing Quantum's initial offer and their vision for Vertex post-acquisition. Given your position as technical architect for Vertex Track and your role in the ownership framework, we wanted you present for this conversation. Martin nodded to one of his colleagues, who slid a document across the table. This outlines our proposed integration plan. Vertex Track would be merged with our financial services division. We're particularly interested in the back-end architecture, quite revolutionary for a company of Vertex's size. I skimmed the document, my concern growing with each paragraph. The integration plan made no mention of maintaining the current development team. Instead, it emphasized knowledge transfer to Quantum's existing engineers, corporate speak for extracting our expertise before potentially dispensing with our services. And the technical ownership framework? I asked, looking up from the document. Martin's smile didn't reach his eyes. As I mentioned, we have our own protocols for managing technical assets. While your framework is impressive, standardization across divisions is essential for a company of our scale. Melissa caught my eye, her expression conveying what she couldn't say aloud. This wasn't just about acquiring technology. It was about acquiring control. The very problem our framework had been designed to address within Vertex would reemerge on a larger scale with Quantum. What's your timeline for this proposed merger? I asked, choosing my words carefully. We're prepared to move quickly, Martin replied. 30 days for due diligence, then implementation of the integration plan within 60 days of closing. 90 days. In just 3 months, everything we'd built could be dismantled, our team dispersed, our carefully crafted systems absorbed into Quantum's corporate machinery. Thomas leaned forward. We've requested time to consider the offer and discuss it with key stakeholders. No decisions have been made. Of course, Martin said smoothly. But I should note that our offer is time-sensitive. The market moves quickly, as you know. After they left, the room remained silent for a long moment. Thomas finally spoke. They're offering 30% above our current market valuation, he said quietly. The board will find that compelling. And what happens to our team? To Vertex Track? I asked. Their integration plan is vague on those details, Melissa admitted. But reading between the lines, they'll extract what they want and discard the rest, I finished for her, including the technical ownership framework. Thomas sighed. Sarah, I value what you've built here, but I have a responsibility to consider the company's financial interests. If the board decides this offer makes sense, I understand, I interrupted. But before any decision is made, I'd like the opportunity to present an alternative vision. What Vertex could become independently if we continue on our current trajectory. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. The board meets next Tuesday to discuss the offer. Prepare your case by then. As I walked back to my desk, my mind was already racing. This wasn't just about protecting my role, or even the framework I'd developed. It was about preserving the culture we'd built, one that respected technical contribution and thoughtful architecture over quick profits and corporate assimilation. I spent the next 5 days gathering data, building projections, and developing a comprehensive vision for Vertex's independent future. I worked late into each night, fueled by determination and the knowledge that everything we'd fought for hung in the balance. Jason noticed my intensity and offered help without my having to ask. "I've pulled the usage metrics for Vertex Track over the past 6 months," he said, placing a folder on my desk. "Growth is accelerating since we implemented the interactive dashboard, especially in the financial sector." I smiled gratefully. "Thanks. That's exactly what I need for this presentation." "Is it true? About quantum dynamics?" he asked hesitantly. News of the potential acquisition had spread through the company despite management's attempts at discretion. The uncertainty was affecting everyone. "They've made an offer," I confirmed, "but nothing's decided yet. If they buy us—" He trailed off. "Let's focus on making sure the board has all the information they need to make the right decision," I said, not wanting to feed the anxiety already permeating the office. The night before the board meeting, I received an unexpected visitor. David knocked on the glass wall of my office, where I was still working well past normal hours. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded, curious about what brought him here so late. "I heard you're presenting to the board tomorrow," he said, taking a seat across from me. "About the quantum offer." "I'm presenting an alternative path forward," I clarified. "Independence has advantages they should consider alongside the acquisition offer." David was quiet for a moment, studying the charts and projections spread across my desk. "When I first came to Vertex," he said finally, "I saw it as a stepping stone. A smaller company I could reshape quickly to build my resume before moving on to somewhere bigger." He met my eyes directly. "I was wrong about a lot of things." The admission surprised me. David had never been this forthcoming about his motivations. "The technical ownership framework changed my perspective," he continued. "I've seen how it's transformed our development process, improved retention, even attracted new talent. That doesn't happen with superficial management tricks. It happens when you build something authentic." I waited, sensing he had more to say. "Quantum doesn't care about any of that," he said bluntly. "I know their playbook because I used to admire it. Acquire, extract value, consolidate, discard what doesn't fit their model. The framework, the culture you've built, it will all disappear." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I'm fighting this." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "These are the real numbers on Quantum's last 3 acquisitions. What they promised versus what actually happened to the acquired company's products and personnel." He placed it on my desk. "Use it if it helps." I stared at him, genuinely confused by this unexpected alliance. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I was wrong about Vertex Track, and I was wrong about you," he said simply. "And because I've finally found a company culture worth fighting for, even if I initially tried to change it without understanding its value." After he left, I incorporated his data into my presentation. The figures confirmed what I'd suspected. Quantum's integration plans typically resulted in the dissolution of acquired companies' unique cultures and processes, regardless of initial promises to preserve them. Tuesday morning arrived with gray skies and a steady rain that matched the somber mood at Vertex. As I prepared to enter the boardroom, Melissa caught up with me in the hallway. "Martin from Quantum is here," she warned. "He requested to attend the meeting to answer any questions about their offer." My heart sank. I'd prepared my presentation assuming I'd be addressing only the board, not defending it against direct counter-arguments from Quantum's acquisition team. "You've got this," Melissa said firmly. "Just remember why we're fighting." Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was formal and tense. The 8 members of Vertex's board, a mix of investors, industry veterans, and company executives, sat around the polished table. Thomas nodded to me encouragingly. Martin sat near the end, looking confident and slightly amused, as though the outcome were already determined. "Thank you for the opportunity to present today," I began, connecting my laptop to the display. "You're considering a significant offer from Quantum Dynamics that would change the future of Vertex Digital Solutions. Before you decide, I want to share an alternative vision. What Vertex could become if we remain independent and continue building on the foundation we've established." For the next 30 minutes, I presented data on Vertex Track's growth trajectory, customer acquisition trends, and the measurable impact of the technical ownership framework on product stability and developer retention. I outlined a 3-year growth plan that would increase Vertex's valuation by 45%, more than Quantum's premium, though over a longer time frame. The choice isn't just between selling now or continuing as we are, I emphasized. It's between short-term financial gain and building something of lasting value that will ultimately yield greater returns while preserving the innovation engine we've created. I concluded with specific examples of how Quantum's previous acquisitions had played out for the acquired companies, using the data David had provided. In each case, the unique value proposition that made these companies acquisition targets was ultimately diluted or lost entirely through integration. The same would likely happen to Vertex Track and our technical ownership framework. When I finished, the room was quiet. Several board members were reviewing my projections with thoughtful expressions. Martin, however, was smiling confidently. "May I respond?" he asked Thomas, who nodded. "This is an impressive analysis," Martin began, his tone suggesting the opposite. "But it relies on speculative growth projections based on limited market presence. Quantum offers certainty, a guaranteed return on investment now, not a theoretical one 3 years from now." He turned to face the board directly. "As for the concerns about integration, I must emphasize that Quantum values the innovation that makes companies like Vertex attractive acquisition targets. We have no intention of dismantling what works. That would be counter to our interests. Yet, that's exactly what happened with Tech Fusion and Meridian Systems," I pointed out, referencing 2 companies from my slides. Both were assured their core products and teams would remain intact. Within a year, their flagship products were discontinued and most of their technical staff let go. Martin's smile tightened. "Each acquisition is unique. Market conditions change. Decisions are made based on evolving business requirements." "Exactly," I countered. "And those decisions will be made by Quantum executives with no connection to what makes Vertex Track valuable, its architecture, its team, and the framework that ensures knowledge continuity." The exchange continued for another 20 minutes, with Martin emphasizing certainty and immediate returns, while I advocated for long-term vision and preserving what made Vertex unique. The board members asked pointed questions of both of us, revealing their own divided perspectives. Finally, Thomas called for a brief recess before the board would begin their closed deliberations. As everyone filed out of the room, Martin approached me. "That was quite a performance," he said, his voice low. "But you're fighting the inevitable. Tech companies your size don't remain independent in this market. They get acquired or they get crushed by larger competitors. That conventional wisdom ignores companies that find defensible niches by doing something unique," I replied evenly. "Something competitors can't easily replicate, like our framework." His expression hardened. "Frameworks and processes are just corporate window dressing. Technology is what matters, and technology can be replicated or purchased. That perspective is exactly why our framework exists," I said. "It recognizes that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's shaped by the people who build it and the knowledge they embed in it." "Idealistic, but naive," he dismissed. "The board understands business reality." As he walked away, I wondered if he was right. Were we fighting a losing battle against market forces too powerful to resist? Was independence truly viable, or just a romantic notion in an industry dominated by acquisition and consolidation? The uncertainty followed me as I waited in a small conference room during the board's deliberations. Melissa joined me briefly, but neither of us had much to say. The decision was out of our hands now. After what felt like hours, Thomas's assistant appeared. "They're ready for you." Walking back into the boardroom, I tried to read the expressions around the table, but the board members maintained neutral, professional composures. Thomas gestured for me to take a seat. "The board has reached a decision regarding Quantum's offer," he announced formally. "After careful consideration of both the acquisition proposal and the independent growth strategy presented today, we have decided to decline Quantum's current offer." Relief flooded through me, so intense I had to focus on keeping my expression professional. "However," Thomas continued, "this decision comes with conditions. The board has approved a modified version of the 3-year growth plan with quarterly review milestones. If those milestones aren't met, we will reconsider acquisition options." "Understood," I said, already mentally revising projections and implementation timelines. "Additionally, we want the technical ownership framework expanded to include more robust metrics for evaluating technical asset value, something that would make future valuation discussions more concrete." I nodded. This was actually an improvement I'd been considering but hadn't yet formalized. "Martin has been informed of our decision," Thomas added. Needless to say, he was disappointed, but indicated Quantum might revisit their offer in the future if circumstances change. As the meeting concluded, several board members approached me individually. Some were clearly supportive of the independence decision, while others seemed more skeptical, having voted for it with reservations. All of them, however, acknowledged the compelling nature of the alternative path I'd presented. "You've bought us time," Melissa said as we walked back toward the main office area. "But the pressure's on to deliver on those projections." "We will," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The framework is just beginning to show results. As it matures, the benefits will accelerate." "I hope you're right," she replied. "Because Quantum won't be the last company to come knocking if Vertex Track continues its growth trajectory." The news of the board's decision spread quickly through the company. The relief was palpable. Most employees had feared the worst when rumors of the potential acquisition surfaced. But mixed with the relief was anxiety about the conditional nature of the decision. We all understood that our future independence depended on meeting ambitious growth targets. I called a meeting of the Vertex Track development team the following morning. 20 faces looked back at me with expressions ranging from cautious optimism to outright concern. "The board has given us the opportunity to prove that independence is viable," I began. "Now we need to deliver. This isn't just about meeting quarterly targets. It's about demonstrating that our approach to technical ownership creates sustainable value that can't be replicated through acquisition and consolidation." Jason raised his hand. "The growth projections you presented were ambitious. Are they actually achievable?" It was a fair question, one that was undoubtedly on everyone's mind. "They're challenging but realistic," I answered honestly. "And we have advantages conventional metrics don't capture. Our client retention rate is 94% because we've built systems that truly meet their needs. Our team retention is 87% since implementing the framework, in an industry that averages 70%. Those factors compound over time in ways that accelerate growth." Wei spoke up next. "What happens if we miss a quarterly target?" "We adjust and learn," I said. "The board isn't looking for perfection. They're looking for trajectory." 1. Missed target won't trigger a reconsideration if the overall direction remains positive. The questions continued for nearly an hour, ranging from technical concerns about scaling Vertex Track to accommodate projected growth to worries about individual job security. I answered each one as transparently as I could, neither sugarcoating the challenges nor dwelling on the risks. "This won't be easy," I concluded. but we've already proven we can build something valuable enough that a company like Quantum wants to acquire it. Now, we need to prove we can grow it into something even more valuable by maintaining our independence and our approach to technical ownership. As the team dispersed, I noticed David standing at the back of the room. He'd attended the meeting, silently, listening to the concerns and my responses without interjecting. "Convincing presentation," he said as I gathered my notes. "But private equity firms like the ones represented on our board typically have short attention spans when it comes to independent strategies. They want returns, not philosophical victories." "Then we'll give them returns," I replied. "The framework isn't just about technical integrity. It directly impacts productivity, quality, and client satisfaction. Those factors drive financial performance." David nodded slowly. "I believe you, but belief doesn't matter. Results do. How can I help?" His question caught me off guard. After our confrontation over Vertex Track and the framework, we'd established a professional working relationship, but not a collaborative one. This was the first time he'd explicitly offered support. "We need to translate technical quality into client acquisition," I said after a moment's consideration. "That's your strength, helping potential clients understand the business value of technical excellence. I'll develop a strategic outreach plan targeting financial institutions that would benefit most from Vertex Track's capabilities," he suggested, with concrete examples of how our technical approach translates to their business metrics. "That would be valuable," I agreed, "and we should coordinate on the quarterly review preparations for the board. They need to see both technical progress and business impact presented as an integrated narrative." We continued the discussion, outlining a coordinated approach that leveraged both our strengths, my technical architecture expertise and his business development skills. For the first time, it felt like we were truly working toward the same goal rather than navigating around each other. The following weeks brought intense work as we implemented our growth strategy. The entire company seemed energized by the challenge, despite the pressure. Having faced the prospect of acquisition and chosen independence instead, everyone felt a renewed commitment to proving that decision correct. Vertex Track's development accelerated, with new features implementing machine learning capabilities that Melissa had advocated for months earlier. Client demos generated enthusiastic responses, with 3 major financial institutions signing letters of intent for enterprise-wide deployment. The technical ownership framework continued to evolve as well. We developed more sophisticated metrics for evaluating technical asset value, as the board had requested. These metrics went beyond code quality and documentation to include factors like knowledge distribution across the team, transition readiness, and innovation capacity, measures that captured the true business value of our technical approach. When the first quarterly review arrived, we were prepared. Thomas had arranged for the full board to attend, including the investors who had been most skeptical about declining Quantum's offer. "In the 3 months since rejecting the acquisition offer," I began, "Vertex has achieved 127% of our projected growth targets. Vertex Track has added 7 new enterprise clients, expanded deployment with 12 existing clients, and maintained 100% client retention." The presentation continued with detailed breakdowns of technical achievements, business metrics, and the measurable impact of the technical ownership framework on both. David presented the market expansion strategy, highlighting how our technical approach created competitive advantages in client acquisition. "What's most significant," I emphasized toward the end, "is that these results aren't anomalies or short-term gains. They're the natural outcomes of our integrated approach to technical ownership and business growth. The framework doesn't just make our engineers happier. It directly drives the metrics this board cares about." When we finished, the atmosphere in the room had shifted noticeably. The skepticism that had characterized many board members' expressions at the beginning had given way to cautious optimism. Even the private equity representatives were engaged, asking detailed questions about scalability and market penetration rather than revisiting the acquisition decision. As the meeting concluded, the lead investor, a usually taciturn venture capitalist named Hurried, approached me. "I voted against independence," she said bluntly. "I believed Quantum's offer represented the optimal return profile given market conditions and Vertex's size disadvantage." She paused. "I'm pleased to be proven wrong so far." "Thank you," I replied. "We're just getting started." She studied me with shrewd eyes. "What you've built with this framework, it's unusual. Most technical organizations talk about knowledge management and transition protocols, but it rarely translates to measurable business outcomes. You've managed that translation effectively." "Because we designed it as a business tool from the beginning," I explained. "Not just an engineering best practice." Eleanor nodded. "Maintain this trajectory, and independence won't just be viable, it will be clearly preferable to acquisition. That's rare for companies at your stage." As she walked away, David joined me. "That's the closest thing to enthusiasm I've ever seen from Eleanor," he remarked, "and she's backed over 30 successful tech companies. One good quarter doesn't guarantee our future," I reminded him. "We need to maintain this momentum." "And we will," he said with unexpected confidence. "What happened today wasn't luck or temporary progress. It was validation of an approach that's fundamentally sound." He extended his hand. "Congratulations. You've changed the direction of this company." As we shook hands, I reflected on how far we'd come, not just in terms of business metrics or board confidence, but in establishing a new model for how technical contribution could be valued and leveraged for growth. The journey had begun with a personal offense, having my project reassigned, but had evolved into something much more significant. Quantum would probably return with another offer someday. Other acquirers might appear as well. But we were no longer just potential acquisition targets, waiting to be absorbed into larger corporate structures. We were charting our own course, driven by a vision of technical ownership that was proving its worth in the marketplace. And that, I realized, was the most meaningful victory of all. Not just preserving what we'd built, but demonstrating that there was a viable alternative to the conventional acquire or be acquired wisdom of the tech industry. An alternative that respected technical knowledge as a core business asset rather than an interchangeable commodity. As the board members filed out, Thomas caught my eye and gave a subtle nod of approval. We both knew this was just the beginning of a challenging journey. But for the first time, it felt like we were truly in control of our destination. 6 months after the board's decision to remain independent, Vertex Digital Solutions had transformed almost beyond recognition. Our offices now occupied 3 floors of the downtown Seattle building instead of 1. The development team had grown from 20 engineers to 35, each carefully selected not just for technical skill, but for their alignment with our collaborative culture. Vertex Track had evolved from a powerful analytics tool to an industry-leading platform, with financial institutions across North America competing to be early adopters of each new feature release. But the most significant transformation wasn't visible in our expanded office space or growing client list. It was in how we operated as an organization, with technical expertise and business strategy no longer siloed from each other, but integrated through the technical ownership framework that had now been refined through multiple iterations. I was reviewing the latest deployment metrics in my corner office, a recent upgrade that still felt strange after years of working from an open floor desk when Jason knocked on my door. "The integration with Transfin's legacy systems is complete," he announced with well-earned pride. 3 weeks ahead of schedule and with zero downtime for their traders. Transfin was our newest and largest client, a multinational financial services corporation that had approached us after hearing about Vertex Track at an industry conference. Integrating our platform with their decades-old trading systems had been a formidable challenge, one that would have been nearly impossible before our framework established clear protocols for handling legacy system interactions. "That's impressive work," I said, genuinely pleased. Jason had grown tremendously over the past months, from an overconfident intern to a thoughtful technical lead who now managed his own team. "The attribution documentation is complete?" He nodded. "Full technical, architecture mapping, key decision points documented, and contribution tracking for all team members. It's all in the repository, tagged and linked to the deployment record." These protocols, which once would have seemed like bureaucratic overhead, had become second nature to our teams. We'd learned that careful documentation of who built, what and why didn't slow innovation as many feared. It accelerated it by preserving institutional knowledge and preventing the same problems from being solved repeatedly. "Perfect timing," I told him. "The Transfin CTO is visiting tomorrow. He specifically asked to understand how we maintained such high quality through a complex integration." "Would you like me to present the technical approach?" Jason offered, a hint of eagerness in his voice. I smiled, remembering how far we'd come from the days when he was dismantling my code without understanding it. "Absolutely. You led the integration. You should get the recognition for its success." As Jason left, my phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Thomas's office. Now, bring champagne." Curious, I grabbed my tablet and headed to the executive floor. As I approached Thomas's office, I heard voices and laughter, unusual for our typically reserved CEO. When I entered, I found Thomas, Melissa, David, and Eleanor Reed from the board all gathered around a conference table covered with documents. "Perfect timing," Thomas said, echoing my words to Jason moments earlier. "We were just about to call you." "What's going on?" I asked, noting their barely contained excitement. Eleanor pushed a financial report toward me. "The final valuation came in this morning. Vertex is now officially worth 3 times what Quantum offered 18 months ago." I stared at the figure on the report, momentarily speechless. We'd been tracking steady growth, meeting and exceeding each quarterly target, but I hadn't realized we'd crossed such a significant threshold. 3 times, I finally managed. "That's vindication," Eleanor finished for me, "of your strategy, your framework, and the decision to remain independent." She raised her coffee mug in a mock toast. "I've never been happier to be proven wrong in my initial assessment." "This isn't just about market valuation," Melissa added. "Our technical staff retention is at 96% when the industry average has dropped to 67%. Client renewals are at 98%. These are unprecedented numbers for a company our size in this sector. The technical ownership framework has become our primary competitive advantage," David said. "Clients aren't just buying our software anymore. They're buying our approach. 3 financial institutions have asked us to consult on implementing similar frameworks for their own development teams." Thomas gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Sarah. This celebration is well-deserved, but it's also a prelude to an important discussion." As I took a seat, I noticed a stack of folders labeled Strategic Growth Initiative at the center of the table. Thomas slid one toward me. "The board has unanimously approved a major expansion," he explained. "Not just of Vertex Track, but of the framework itself as a product offering." I opened the folder to find a detailed business plan for transforming the technical ownership framework from an internal methodology to a formal consulting practice with training programs, assessment tools, and implementation support services. "You want to commercialize the framework?" I asked, trying to process this unexpected development. "It's the logical next step," Eleanor said pragmatically. "You've proven its value internally. Now there's significant market demand from organizations facing the same challenges Vertex once did. We've already received informal inquiries from 12 companies across different sectors," David added. "Not just tech firms, but financial institutions, healthcare organizations, even government agencies struggling with knowledge continuity and technical ownership issues." The proposal outlined a dedicated division within Vertex, separate from Vertex Track but complementary to it, focused entirely on helping organizations implement customized versions of the framework. It would require hiring specialized consultants, developing training materials, and creating assessment methodologies. "We want you to lead this initiative," Thomas said, as Chief Technical Officer of Vertex Digital Solutions. My head snapped up. CTO? But Melissa was planning to retire next year anyway. Melissa finished with a smile. "But this accelerates my timeline in the best possible way. The company needs someone who embodies the technical ownership philosophy to lead its next phase of growth." I looked around the table at these 4 people who had been part of this journey from different angles. Thomas, who had ultimately backed the framework when it was just an idea. Melissa, who had supported my technical vision from the beginning. Eleanor, who had voted against independence but now championed our approach. And David, who had begun as an adversary but become a crucial ally. "This is unexpected," I admitted. "But well-deserved," Thomas said firmly. "You transformed a personal setback into an organizational strength. Then you evolved that strength into a market differentiator. Now you have the opportunity to make it an industry standard. We'll need to be careful about scaling the framework without diluting its core principles," I cautioned, already thinking through the implementation challenges. Its value comes from authentic commitment to technical ownership, not just surface-level processes. "Exactly why you need to lead this," Melissa said. "You understand both the technical architecture and the human elements that make it work." As the discussion continued into specific implementation details, a notification appeared on my tablet, an email from Transfin's CTO confirming tomorrow's visit, with an added note. "Looking forward to discussing how your framework might help us address our own technical debt and knowledge transfer challenges." The timing was almost too perfect. What had begun as a defensive measure to protect my work had evolved into a company-wide philosophy, then a competitive advantage, and now potentially an entirely new business direction. "I'll need time to develop a detailed transition plan for my current responsibilities," I said, already mentally reorganizing priorities. "Jason is ready to take on more leadership with Vertex Track. He's grown tremendously." "Speaking of transitions," David interjected, "this is a good time to address succession planning for engineering leadership generally. The framework gives us a structure, but we need to identify and prepare the next generation of technical leaders." It was a prudent suggestion, one that revealed how fully David had embraced the ownership mindset. He was now thinking not just about immediate business objectives, but about long-term knowledge continuity. "That should be a core component of the expansion plan," I agreed. "Not just selling the framework as a methodology, but embodying its principles in how we grow." As the meeting concluded, Thomas asked me to stay behind. When the others had left, he closed the door and turned to me with a more serious expression. "There's something else you should know," he said. "Quantum approached us again last week." My stomach tightened. "With another acquisition offer?" "No," Thomas said, surprising me. "With a partnership proposal. They've been watching our growth and the impact of the framework. Instead of trying to acquire us, they want to implement the framework within their own organization, with our guidance." I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The same framework they dismissed as corporate window dressing 18 months ago? "Martin Reynolds is no longer with Quantum," Thomas explained. "Their new head of strategy has a different perspective on technical asset management." She specifically cited our retention rates and client satisfaction metrics as evidence that our approach offers sustainable competitive advantages. This development was perhaps the most validating of all. Quantum, which had once sought to absorb and potentially dismantle our work, now wanted to learn from it. "Are we considering their proposal?" I asked. "That will be one of your first decisions as CTO," Thomas replied. "The board has agreed that our approach to potential competitors should align with the technical leadership's assessment of risk and opportunity." It was a significant vote of confidence, not just in me personally, but in the technical governance structure we'd established. Strategic decisions about our intellectual property would be guided by those who understood it best, not dictated solely by financial considerations. The following day, the visit from Transfin's CTO unfolded as a perfect case study in how far we'd come. Jason presented the integration architecture with confidence and clarity, highlighting not just the technical solutions, but the collaborative process that had ensured its success. Each component has clear ownership attribution, he explained, showing the interactive system map we developed as part of the framework. When questions arise or changes are needed, we know exactly who holds the deep knowledge about each element. Transfin's CTO, a veteran technologist named Raj Patel, nodded appreciatively. This addresses one of our biggest pain points. We have critical systems built years ago by people who are long gone, with minimal documentation about the underlying design decisions. That's exactly the problem the framework was designed to solve, I explained. Technical knowledge isn't just in the code. It's in understanding why the code exists in the form it does. And how did you implement this culturally? Raj asked. In my experience, process changes often face resistance, especially from experienced developers. It was an insightful question that went to the heart of why many technical initiatives fail despite sound theory. We started with recognition, I explained, ensuring that contributions were visibly attributed and valued. The framework isn't about bureaucratic overhead. It's about giving credit where it's due and preserving the thought process behind technical decisions. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, evolving from a client review into a deep discussion about the broader applications of the framework. By the time Raj left, we had sketched the outline of a potential consulting engagement to help Transfin implement a customized version of our approach. As I walked him to the elevator, he made an observation that stayed with me. What's remarkable is how you've managed to formalize something that's typically informal in most organizations. Technical ownership usually depends on institutional memory and individual goodwill. You've made it systematic without making it rigid. His words captured what I hadn't been able to articulate fully: the delicate balance the framework struck between structure and flexibility, between process and empowerment. The following weeks were a whirlwind of transition planning as I prepared to step into the CTO role. I spent hours with Jason and other team leads ensuring they were ready to take on expanded responsibilities. The Vertex track development wouldn't stop or even slow during this organizational shift. If anything, it would accelerate as we applied the framework's principles to new challenges. During this period, David proved an unexpectedly valuable ally. His business perspective complemented my technical focus as we developed the structure for the new consulting practice. We need to be selective about early clients, he advised during one planning session. Choose organizations that genuinely want to transform their approach to technical ownership, not just implement surface-level processes to check a box. Agreed, I said. The framework fails without authentic commitment from both technical teams and leadership. We should establish criteria for determining which engagements to accept. Our working relationship had evolved from early antagonism to grudging respect to genuine collaboration. We still approached problems from different angles. He from business strategy, me from technical architecture, but those perspectives now complemented rather than conflicted with each other. One afternoon, David stopped by my office with an unusual request. "I'd like your input on something personal," he said, closing the door behind him. Curious, I gestured for him to continue. "I've been approached about a CEO position at a mid-sized tech firm in Portland," he said. "It's a good opportunity, but I'm conflicted about leaving Vertex at this point in our growth." The revelation surprised me. Despite our improved relationship, David rarely discussed personal matters or career considerations with me. "What's driving your uncertainty?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "I've learned something important at Vertex that I'm not sure exists in many other organizations. The framework has shown me that technical depth and business strategy aren't opposing forces. They're complementary when properly integrated. I'm not sure I want to return to environments where those functions are perpetually in conflict. His insight showed how profoundly the framework had influenced even those who were initially skeptical. It wasn't just a methodology for managing code. It was an approach to organizational leadership that bridged traditional divides. You could implement similar principles there, I suggested. You understand the framework well enough now to adapt it to a new environment. Perhaps, he acknowledged, but it would mean starting from scratch, without the foundation that already exists here. He shook his head. I haven't decided yet. I just wanted your perspective since you've been central to what makes this place different. After he left, I reflected on how much had changed since our early confrontations. David had evolved from someone who dismissed my work without understanding it to someone who recognized its value so deeply that it influenced his career decisions. It was perhaps the most personal validation of the framework's impact, affecting not just processes and metrics, but individual perspectives and choices. The official announcement of my promotion to CTO came on a Wednesday morning, coinciding with the public unveiling of Vertex's new consulting division focused on the technical ownership framework. The company-wide meeting in our largest conference room was standing room only, with team members from all departments gathered to hear Thomas outline the strategic expansion. This represents more than organizational growth, he said after explaining the new structure. It's the evolution of an idea that began with recognizing the value of technical expertise and has grown into a philosophy that now defines our company. As I stepped up to address the room, I saw a sea of familiar faces, engineers who had witnessed the framework's development from its earliest stages, newer team members who had joined specifically because of our approach, business staff who had initially been skeptical but now enthusiastically supported the integration of technical and strategic thinking. When I first developed what would become the technical ownership framework, I began. It was in response to a specific challenge, ensuring that technical knowledge wasn't lost during transitions. What I didn't anticipate was how this approach would transform not just our development process, but our entire organizational culture. I outlined the vision for the new consulting practice, emphasizing that it would adhere to the same principles it advocated: clear attribution, knowledge continuity, and respectful integration of different perspectives. We're not just selling a methodology, I explained. We're sharing an approach that has fundamentally changed how we work, how we collaborate, and how we value different forms of expertise. As the presentation concluded and people filtered back to their respective departments, Jason approached with an unexpected question. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out? He asked. If David hadn't reassigned Vertex Track to me, if you hadn't still had access to the AWS infrastructure, if the system hadn't crashed when it did. His question gave me pause. I rarely dwelled on those early events anymore. They seemed distant compared to all that had happened since. I think about the catalyst, not the specifics, I said after a moment. The situation forced me to articulate something I had felt, intuitively but never formalized. That technical knowledge has value beyond the code itself, and that value needs to be recognized and protected. So in a way, David did you a favor, Jason suggested with a hint of irony. I smiled at the thought. Let's say he created an opportunity that might not have emerged otherwise. The framework probably would have developed eventually, but perhaps not as quickly or comprehensively without that initial challenge. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Eleanor Reed. I've just left a board meeting at Centauri Tech, she said without preamble. They're implementing your framework across their engineering division after seeing Vertex's results. 3 other companies in my portfolio are considering similar initiatives. As a venture capitalist with investments in dozens of tech firms, Eleanor had a broad perspective on industry trends. Her call confirmed what we'd begun to suspect. The impact of the framework was extending far beyond Vertex. The most interesting part, she continued, is that it's spreading organically through the technical community, not just through formal channels. Engineers who experience it at one company are advocating for similar approaches when they move to new organizations. This organic adoption was perhaps the most meaningful validation. Technical professionals recognizing the value of the framework and carrying it with them as they progressed in their careers. "We're launching the consulting practice at exactly the right moment," Eleanor observed. "You've created something that addresses a pervasive problem in an industry that's notorious for reinventing the wheel and losing institutional knowledge." The following week brought another significant milestone. I received an invitation to keynote the annual Software Architecture Conference, one of the most prestigious technical events in the industry. The topic they requested: Beyond Code, Building Sustainable Technical Knowledge Ecosystems. As I prepared my presentation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. What had begun as a personal response to having my project reassigned had evolved into something that was now influencing how technical work was valued and managed across the industry. The day before the conference, I received a notification that a new repository had been created in our company GitHub organization, Technical Ownership Framework Open Source. Curious, I clicked through to find a comprehensive collection of documentation, templates, assessment tools, and implementation guides, all the core components of our framework, structured for public use. A note at the top explained, "With executive approval, we're open sourcing the foundational elements of the technical ownership framework. While our consulting practice will offer customized implementation and training, these core components should be available to any organization seeking to improve technical ownership and knowledge continuity." The repository had been created by Jason, with contributions from several other engineers who had been instrumental in refining the framework over time. Each contribution was meticulously attributed, a perfect embodiment of the framework's principles applied to the framework itself. At the bottom of the README file was a simple acknowledgement. This framework began with one person standing up for the value of technical knowledge. It continues because that value is universal. I sat back in my chair, unexpectedly moved by this initiative. Open sourcing the framework wasn't something I had considered. Our focus had been on developing it as a consulting offering, but it made perfect sense. The principles at the heart of the framework weren't proprietary. They were fundamental truths about how technical knowledge should be valued and preserved. Making the core elements freely available wouldn't diminish the value of our consulting practice. If anything, it would extend the framework's influence further, creating a community of practitioners who could contribute to its evolution. Most sophisticated implementations would still benefit from guided expertise, but the basic principles would be accessible to anyone. I added my approval to the repository and sent Jason a message. "This is exactly right. The framework should be open to anyone who values technical ownership. Well done." The next morning, as I prepared to leave for the conference, Thomas stopped by my office. "The open source initiative was a surprise," he said, "but a good one. It aligns perfectly with our larger mission." "It wasn't my idea," I admitted. "Jason and the team developed it independently." Thomas smiled. "That's the true measure of success, when the people you've mentored take initiative to extend your work in ways you hadn't imagined." He handed me a small package. "A gift for your first official appearance as CTO." Inside was a business card holder with a simple inscription, "Technical knowledge made visible." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. As I drove to the conference center, I reflected on the strange, winding path that had led to this moment. If someone had told me 2 years ago that having my project reassigned would ultimately lead to becoming CTO and developing an industry-influencing framework, I would have dismissed it as wishful thinking. Yet here I was, prepared to address hundreds of technical leaders about an approach that had grown from a personal challenge to an organizational philosophy, to a broader movement within the industry. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very act that was intended to diminish my contribution had ultimately amplified it beyond anything I could have achieved by simply continuing to work on Vertex Track as originally planned. As I walked onto the stage to deliver my keynote, I saw a room full of technical professionals who faced the same challenges I had. Having their work undervalued, their expertise overlooked, their contributions minimized. They needed not just technical solutions, but a framework for ensuring their knowledge was recognized and preserved. Technical ownership isn't just about who wrote the code, I began. It's about preserving the why behind the what, the context, the constraints, the considerations that shaped each decision. When we lose that knowledge, we don't just lose efficiency, we lose the foundation for meaningful innovation. Looking out at the attentive faces, I knew the framework would continue to evolve in ways I couldn't predict, shaped by the needs and insights of a growing community of practitioners. The journey that had begun with one repository access oversight had become something much larger, a movement to transform how technical contribution was valued throughout the industry. And in that moment, I felt not vindication for past slights, but gratitude for the unexpected path that had led here, to an opportunity to address a systemic issue that affected countless technical professionals, to offer a solution that had proven its worth in practice, and to build a community dedicated to preserving the value of technical knowledge. The greatest resolution wasn't personal at all. It was the knowledge that something positive and enduring had emerged from what once seemed like merely a professional setback, something that would continue to grow and evolve long after the original conflict was forgotten. 3 years to the day after my keynote at the Software Architecture Conference, I found myself standing in the atrium of Vertex's new headquarters. The expansive space was filled with engineers, business leaders, and industry professionals gathered for the inaugural Technical Ownership Summit, an event that had drawn participants from across the globe. "Can you believe how far we've come?" Jason asked, joining me by the large windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. No longer the eager intern who had once unwittingly dismantled my code, he now served as the director of engineering for Vertex Track, leading a team of 50 developers. "Sometimes it still surprises me," I admitted, watching attendees network and exchange ideas. "I never imagined that responding to one workplace challenge would create all of this." The summit represented the culmination of everything we'd built. Over the past 3 years, the technical ownership framework had evolved from a company methodology to an open-source project to a recognized industry standard. More than 500 organizations now implemented versions of the framework, adapted to their specific needs but adhering to the core principles of attribution, knowledge continuity, and technical governance. "Your keynote starts in 20 minutes, Jason reminded me. "The main hall is already filling up." I nodded, taking one more moment to observe the vibrant community that had formed around what began as a personal response to having my work undervalued. Engineers from competing companies conversed openly, sharing implementation strategies and success stories. Technical leaders exchanged insights on governance models. Even academic researchers had begun studying the framework's impact on knowledge, retention, and organizational effectiveness. As I made my way toward the stage, familiar faces greeted me. Melissa, now officially retired but still involved as an advisor. Thomas, still CEO, but now frequently speaking alongside me at industry events about the business impact of technical ownership. Eleanor, who had become one of the framework's most vocal advocates in venture capital circles, encouraging portfolio companies to adopt it early in their development. And David, who had ultimately declined the CEO position in Portland to remain at Vertex as Chief Strategy Officer. Our relationship had evolved into a partnership built on mutual respect and complementary perspectives. We still occasionally disagreed about specific approaches, but those disagreements now led to stronger solutions rather than conflict. "Packed house," he commented, falling into step beside me. The panel on measuring technical ownership metrics was standing room only. People are hungry for this. They've always been hungry for it, I reflected. They just didn't have a language or structure to address it until now. The main hall was indeed filled to capacity, with over 1,000 attendees seated and more, standing along the walls. As I was introduced and stepped onto the stage, the applause was warm and sustained. Recognition not of me personally, but of what the framework had come to represent for so many technical professionals. 3 years ago, I began when the room quieted. I shared a story about a personal challenge that led to a systematic solution. What I couldn't have anticipated then was how deeply that solution would resonate, or how many of you would take those core ideas and expand them in ways I never imagined. I gestured to the diverse audience. Today, the technical ownership framework isn't defined by one person or company. It's shaped by all of you, the community of practitioners who have implemented it, refined it, and proven its value across different organizations and contexts. My keynote focused not on the framework's origins, which were now well known, but on its future, the emerging applications in areas like artificial intelligence ethics, where clear technical ownership was becoming increasingly crucial as systems gained autonomy and complexity. As technology becomes more powerful, the question of who shaped it and why becomes not just operational but ethical, I emphasized. The decisions embedded in our systems reflect the values of their creators. Making those decisions visible and attributable isn't just good engineering practice, it's essential for responsible innovation. After the presentation, during the Q&A session, a young engineer raised a question that made me pause. The framework addresses how technical contributions should be valued within organizations, she said. But what about the broader societal value of technical work? How can we extend these principles to ensure that technology serves the public good? Her question touched on something that had been evolving in my own thinking: how the principles of technical ownership might apply beyond organizational boundaries to larger questions of technological impact and responsibility. That's precisely where I believe the framework needs to grow next, I responded. When technical decisions are clearly attributed and their rationale preserved, we create the foundation for meaningful accountability, not just to employers or clients, but to society as a whole. The discussion continued, exploring how transparency and technical ownership might intersect with emerging regulations on algorithmic accountability and data governance. These weren't questions I had definitive answers for, but the conversation itself represented an important evolution in how the framework was being applied. Later that evening, at the summit reception, I found a quiet moment to step away from the networking and reflect. Standing on the building's rooftop garden, I looked out over the lights of Seattle and considered the strange, winding path that had led here. "Penny for your thoughts," said a familiar voice. Layla, my old friend who had texted me years ago asking about drama at Vertex, joined me at the railing. Now the CTO of her own successful startup, she had implemented the framework from her FII, company's earliest days. "Just contemplating unintended consequences," I replied. "Positive ones for once." She smiled. "You mean how losing access to a code repository led to all this?" She gestured toward the gathering behind us. "It's become quite the origin story." "That's the simplified version," I acknowledged. "But yes, essentially." "You know what I find most interesting?" Layla mused. "It wasn't really about the code or even the access. It was about recognition, having your contribution acknowledged and respected. That's what resonates with people." Her observation struck me as profoundly true. The technical details of what happened with Vertex Track had faded in importance over time. What remained relevant, what connected with thousands of technical professionals, was the fundamental human desire to have one's work valued appropriately. The framework succeeded because it addressed something universal, I agreed. Not just a technical problem, but a human one. As the evening progressed, I circulated among the attendees, listening more than speaking. A security architect from a financial institution described how the framework had helped them maintain continuity through a major leadership transition. A team lead from a healthcare technology firm explained how attribution protocols had improved collaboration between clinical and technical staff. A professor shared findings from a study showing improved retention rates at companies that had implemented the framework comprehensively. Each story represented a unique application of the core principles, adapted to specific contexts, but maintaining the essential focus on making technical knowledge visible and valued. Toward the end of the night, an unexpected guest approached. Martin Reynolds, the former head of strategic acquisitions at Quantum Dynamics, who had once dismissed our framework as corporate window dressing. He had left Quantum shortly after their failed acquisition attempt and now led a smaller technology investment firm. "Remarkable event," he said, extending his hand. "Congratulations on what you've built." I accepted the handshake, curious about his presence. "Thank you. What brings you to the summit?" "Professional interest," he explained. "Several companies in our investment portfolio have implemented your framework with notable results. I wanted to understand it better." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I also owed you an acknowledgement. I was wrong in my assessment 3 years ago. What you've developed has created measurable value." Coming from someone who had once represented the perspective that technical processes were interchangeable and dispensable, this admission carried particular weight. "The framework has evolved significantly since then," I said diplomatically. "We've all learned a great deal through its implementation across different contexts." "Indeed," he agreed, "though the core insight remains the same, that technical knowledge has inherent value beyond the code itself, and that value must be properly recognized." He smiled slightly. "A lesson I've incorporated into our current investment approach." As he moved on to speak with others, I reflected on how perspectives had shifted, not just within Vertex, but throughout the industry. Ideas that once seemed radical, like structuring technical governance around knowledge preservation and attribution, were increasingly viewed as fundamental best practices. The summit continued for 2 more days, with workshops, panel discussions, and case studies, exploring different aspects of the framework's implementation and impact. I participated in many sessions but also made time to listen and learn from others' experiences. On the final afternoon, I moderated a panel featuring technical leaders from 5 organizations that had been early adopters of the framework. Their discussion revealed how the core principles had remained consistent, even as implementation details varied widely based on organizational size, industry, and existing culture. "The key wasn't following a rigid template," explained the CTO of a renewable energy company. "It was embracing the underlying philosophy that technical decisions should be traceable, attributable, and preserved as organizational knowledge. And that engineers should be recognized for their contributions," added a director from a government technology office. "That recognition isn't just about individual credit. It's about creating the conditions for psychological safety and innovation." As the panel concluded and the summit began to wind down, Thomas joined me for a final walk through the venue. "We've already received requests to host regional events in Europe and Asia," he noted. "The demand is extraordinary. It's become something larger than any of us anticipated," I agreed. "A movement rather than just a methodology." "And to think," he mused, "it all began because someone underestimated you and overlooked your access to a system you built." I smiled at the simplification but didn't correct it. The narrative had become somewhat mythologized over time, with the details less important than the principles that emerged from the experience. The following. Monday, back in my office at Vertex headquarters, I found a package waiting on my desk. Inside was a framed printout of the original AWS console screenshot from the day Vertex Track systems had crashed, the moment that had made the oversight visible and set everything in motion. A note accompanied it. A reminder that sometimes our greatest contributions come from moments of crisis. Thank you for turning a system failure into a framework for success. The engineering team. I hung the frame on my office wall, not as a reminder of past conflict, but as a symbol of how unexpected challenges can lead to meaningful innovation. It represented not just a personal vindication, but the beginning of a larger transformation in how technical work was valued. Later that day, I received word that the open-source version of the framework had reached a significant milestone. Over 10,000 organizational repositories on GitHub now included our attribution and ownership protocols. The community of contributors had expanded the original concept in directions I never would have imagined, creating specialized implementations for industries ranging from aerospace to education. What had begun as a solution to a specific workplace challenge had evolved into a movement for recognizing and preserving technical knowledge, not as an abstract ideal, but as a practical approach to building more sustainable and innovative organizations. As I reviewed pull requests for the latest version of the framework documentation, I reflected on the journey. The most meaningful outcome wasn't my personal career progression from engineer to CTO, or even Vertex's growth from a mid-sized company to an industry leader. It was the cultural shift that had occurred within the technical community, a growing recognition that the knowledge embedded in our systems was as valuable as the systems themselves, and that preserving that knowledge required intentional structures for attribution and transition. 6 months after the summit, I received an invitation that brought the journey full circle. A prestigious technical university requested permission to develop a graduate-level course on technical ownership and knowledge continuity, using our framework as the foundational text. The idea that the principles we had developed would be taught to the next generation of engineers, that they might begin their careers with these concepts rather than having to discover them through painful experience, represented perhaps the most significant legacy of all. The course syllabus included a case study based on Vertex Track's near failure and subsequent transformation. The professor had titled it, "From Access Oversight to Industry Standard: How a System Crisis Led to a Knowledge Revolution." Reading that title, I couldn't help but smile at the strange, unpredictable path that had brought us here. What had once seemed like a personal setback had ultimately sparked a movement that was now being formalized in academic curricula, industry standards, and organizational best practices. The framework would continue to evolve long after the original incident was forgotten. It would be shaped by new contributors, adapted to emerging technologies, and applied in contexts I couldn't yet imagine. And that ongoing evolution, the legacy beyond any individual or organization, was perhaps the most fitting resolution to the story that began with one overlooked access permission to a code repository. As I closed my laptop that evening and prepared to leave the office, I paused to look out at the Seattle skyline now illuminated against the night sky. The tech industry, for all its focus on innovation, had long struggled with preserving the knowledge embedded in its systems. The framework offered a path toward addressing that challenge, not perfectly, but thoughtfully and systematically. The journey had taught me that the most powerful response to having one's contribution undervalued wasn't anger or retaliation, but creation. Building something that made such undervaluation less likely for others in the future. Something that changed not just one workplace dynamic, but an industry-wide approach to valuing technical knowledge. And in that transformation lay the true vindication, not personal, but collective. Not a victory over one manager's oversight, but a fundamental shift in how technical work was recognized, preserved, and built upon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.